Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to another one of Ironside's Take30s, today hosted by data scientist. I'm Pam Askar, the Director of Data Science at Ironside, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Paul Hardy, our Executive Vice President of Professional Services. He also leads our data strategy practice. We're going to be talking to you today about how to develop good AI use cases. And before I jump into content, just want to put up the agenda for May. So if you haven't registered for the May sessions, you can do that at that link. I'll put that in the chat window. And also to call out that May 20th is another one hosted by a data scientist. So we'll be talking about specifically the banking industry and data enrichment there. And also as a quick reminder, at any point, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat window and we can get to those at any point during the session, or we'll save some time at the end as well to go through those. So we're going to talk today quickly about why AI, what are some of those barriers to getting started, give you some example use cases, and then we'll talk about our approach to use case development and give you some examples of a real life client that went through those that process.
Great.
Yep, so go ahead here. So if you're joining this to learn about how to build AI use cases, you're probably well aware that the number of businesses adopting AI is growing, that the global market for AI is expanding, that businesses like your competitors are already using it and benefiting from increases in productivity, cost savings. And so now is really the time to build your AI strategy out. And selecting the right use cases is obviously the first step, but arguably the most critical step, and also sometimes most difficult step. It's hard to figure that out and get started. And so that's what we're going to talk to you about today. So Paul, I'm going to turn this over to you for the next part.
Great. Thanks, Pam. Good morning, everybody. As Pam was saying, the time is now for AI use cases and for AI adoption, machine learning adoption in your organizations. And so we wanted to bring up a little bit of data on the status of AI adoption in industry today. So this is a publication put out by O'Reilly, which is a data forecasting and research firm. And they have some pretty interesting and telling results from this. You see this first question: what is the stage of AI adoption in your organization? They've broken it down into 3 groups. Who thinks that they have a mature practice, they're sort of in the evaluation stage, or they're not using it. And the good news is that the train really hasn't left the station, right? The mature practice is only 27%, and 73% of respondents are still in the early stages. So if you read the snippets on the prior slide and it created fear, uncertainty, and doubt in you about being behind and adopting AI, there's a little bit of good news, and that is that everyone, or the majority of folks, are in those early stages. But as those little snippets indicated, right, the time is now, and there's really a sense of urgency to do that. And what we're going to talk about today is how do you get past that kind of overwhelming sense of how to adopt AI, particularly if you're not a large organization that can invest in large groups of data scientists, right? So, and the way to do that is to be use case led. So we're going to talk more about that. And interestingly here, what you'll see is these are those same 3 groups: the mature practice, the evaluation, for those in evaluation stage and those not yet using. And what this little snippet shows is where they're investing their budget. And you can see that mature group has the largest investment in the light blue colors there is above 20%, right? So the early leaders, those that are in that 27%, are accelerating their lead because they're investing in AI for competitive advantage. So the train hasn't left the station, but it's starting to accelerate. So interestingly, same study, what are the most common barriers? Why are people not accelerating in their use of AI and machine learning? And this is very telling, and I'm sure it'll resonate with many of you that are listening about your own organizations, right? What are the main bottlenecks? Well, the company culture does not recognize the need for AI. Hopefully that's changing, and probably today it's coming in the form of more anxiety and angst because of that issue and understanding how to get started and the investments associated with that. But having a company culture that recognizes the importance of AI, again, I think is probably something that's becoming more important today. You see, the second one is difficulty identifying use cases, and our position is that use case selection, company culture issues are related, right? If your organization can't determine how to identify machine learning and AI use cases, well, certainly then you're not going to recognize the need for AI. So we consider those to be kind of linked problems. Then there are other issues that are very understandable. A lack of skilled people. Certainly if you haven't done a significant amount of AI and machine learning, you're not going to have those people. A lack of data or quality issues. This is we think of this as kind of the biggest mental challenge, if you will, to overcome for organizations, because what we hear today, when people are now more willing to talk about AI and machine learning, is that the response that you see here, due to data or infrastructure issues, we're probably 2 years away from being ready for AI. That is not a point of view that you can afford to adopt, right? The competition is just accelerating too quickly. And we're going to talk a little bit about how do you evaluate data to make sure your data is useful. But one of the keys to being business case led is that you do not need a perfected data infrastructure to attack AI and machine learning. And the reason is that you're going to focus on very specific use cases. And you can begin to remediate any data issues that you have around those specific use cases. Do not try to boil the ocean and cure your data infrastructure in advance of adopting AI and machine learning. You can't afford to do it. There are real business cases out there today in your organizations that will create business value, and you've got to start there in a focused manner, okay? And last, those technical infrastructure challenges, again, part of that same lack of data or data quality. Those are very closely tied together. But interestingly, the same study showed that opportunities exist across every enterprise and every part of the enterprise. You see here in which functional parts of the company are AI projects used. And the first one you see in the list, research and development, not surprising that that one is the largest, because particularly in healthcare and science-driven and engineering-driven organizations, there are literal platforms that do modeling using AI for product development purposes, right? So research and development, not surprising. But below that, what you see is every functional area that exists in any organization, whether you're a services-based organization or a product-based organization. These are all functions that exist for the most part in your organization. Some of them are customer-facing, some of them are more back office and very operational, but those opportunities clearly exist everywhere. You can see that they're being deployed everywhere. And here's what's interesting is any one of these functions that has sufficient historical data has the opportunity to employ an AI or an ML use case, right? So Pam's going to talk a little bit about what AI and ML is in business, but keep in mind what it's really about is not image processing AI. It's really about applying machine learning to the decisions that you make in your businesses already today, but making them faster, making them more accurate, right? That's where machine learning is generating the most value. So this may look like a fairly mundane list, but that's important. In fact, a recent McKinsey study showed that that the places where the most value is being created in machine learning is not in some obscure use, but it's by having companies look at where they currently create the most value in the market. What is their special sauce today that they're most proud of? And focusing not on some obscure problem, but that exact thing that they think they already do best, and applying machine learning to that and making it even stronger, okay? Now, because there are so many opportunities, our point of view is that you should build a catalog of these opportunities. Don't just pick one. It's a really important reason. We talked about culture being an issue in the adoption of AI. That was the largest response. Well, you can break your culture with respect to its relationship to machine learning and AI if you pick only one use case and that use case doesn't work. You will set yourself back. And by the way, an important thing to understand about machine learning and AI use cases is they don't always work, not through anyone's fault, not through a breakdown in the data or a breakdown in the technology. Well, perhaps in the data. What we mean by that is there is not always signal, as Pam is going to talk about, in the data that you have, okay? So you may have a great use case and evaluate that use case perfectly, and the answer is, hey, there's really not any signal in that data. We can't find a way to use machine learning to generate additional value in that one case. You have to be sure that that does not put off your organization from the use of AI and machine learning overall, because as you can see in this diagram, it is applicable everywhere. Okay, and so there are ways to accomplish creating these use cases that actually contribute to that cultural change that was at the top of that list. How do you drive positive cultural change? we have a methodology that we believe works on that cultural component while it's working on the substance of these use cases. So I want to turn it back over to Pam to talk about examples of use cases.
Yeah, so when we think about AI and machine learning use cases, what comes to mind for a lot of people are things like Siri, chatbots, image detection, even autonomous cars, right? And those are great examples, and they're very successful in those for those organizations. But these are not always the best way for your organization to find value. So as Paul had mentioned, the best place for you to look is at the decisions and the actions and the tasks that are happening day in and day out in your business, and finding ways to optimize and improve those. So I have a few examples that are a little bit more grounded in very specific businesses. So we worked with a foam manufacturing plant, for example, to help them optimize and adjust their chemical recipe given the weather conditions. So as heat and humidity fluctuate, that can mess with their baking process, right? And that can result in a lot of trial and error and wasted product. So this helps to optimize that recipe and automatically adjust it a bit so they reduce waste. Worked with a post-payment claims recovery system. They had kind of a two-stage system where you've got a very large team of people digging through millions of claims, trying to find ones that might have been injuries caused by auto accidents, right? And then that short list gets sent to an external firm, and that costs money for them to investigate and find opportunities for subrogation. So we were able to use machine learning to identify what are the medical diagnostic codes that co-cluster that actually indicate that this is a car accident, right? And so you skip that whole first step and you just automatically end up with a short list, and that moves on. So we optimize that process. Another example, working with a university, we are able to identify profiles of students that fit the description of successful graduate students so that they could be presented with specific offers to move on to a master's program. Now, that's actually a very versatile use case. It works well in retail, in banking, to identify customers that are appropriate for different offers and campaigns. And then one last example here is working with a utility company to optimize how they assigned these highly specialized and expensive safety inspectors to be on dig sites. So we were able to predict where damage was most likely to happen and automatically assign them to go to those sites so that they could help to prevent that damage. So these are all examples that helped to improve and optimize decisions and actions that are happening every day in these businesses. They may not be the big, image detection things that people think of when they think of AI, but these are attainable, and all of these resulted in high ROI. You can go ahead. The next slide has some other examples across a few different industries. So you may have heard of some of this, claims risk, customer retention, personalized marketing, waste, fraud, and abuse. Enrollment management, predictive maintenance. There really are AI use cases across every single industry and every single functional area. Go ahead, Paul.
Great, thanks, Pam. So let's talk about use cases then. So what is really a use case, an AI use case, right? Because we talk a lot about use cases across business today and across IT today. So what's an AI use case? First of all, it's going to, not surprisingly, address an important business question. But it's got to get down to some level of granularity where you can apply data that you have already in-house, or you can enrich from outside data. So if we want to grow revenue, too high level a question, right? If we want to understand price sensitivity, you're getting more granular, right? So granularity ultimately becomes important. It predicts and prescribes future actions, right? So a lot of analytics today is traditional around descriptive analytics, understanding what has happened and perhaps why it has happened. The great thing about machine learning and AI is it's used to predict and prescribe actions from those predictions going forward. And the implementation must generate real business value. So I spoke earlier about not being overly sidelined by the status of your overall data infrastructure. And that's because you have to focus on a place where you're going to generate business value, right? It's the adage, the old adage of, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? That is the case. think about where you're generating business value and focus there, right? And you want to be able to quantify it. We all know that the way organizations work is if there's an investment required, there's got to be return on that investment identified. And so we'll talk a little bit about how, even for AI use cases, you identify specific ROI, net present value, whatever your financial approach is inside your organization. And interestingly, and this is where the value of AI is in that last bullet point, is you may be reliant upon understanding more than a few drivers. We'll talk about drivers, but that's really the key, right? Today, you have very good, very talented people in your organizations that have accumulated experience, and they make business judgment based on human experience and human intuition. Well, the key here, what a human can't do is incorporate many different variables into their analyses. And that's what AI and machine learning does. It finds patterns in data by being able to absorb all of the data that you feed to it, right? So ultimately, you'll find that we're going to create an AI use case that is reliant upon understanding many of those drivers, and that's where the benefit is. So that's what an AI use case is, but we want to distinguish that from what is a really good AI use case. So a good AI use case has to have business value, but kind of back to the specific data issues, it has to have sufficient, clean, historical data. Why historical data? Because that's where we begin to understand the patterns by looking at what's happened in the past. But we want that to be of sufficient quantity that we can develop good signal analysis out of it. And to the degree we can, we want it to be clean, right? But again, take this on a use case by use case basis. Don't think about your overall data infrastructure, whether it can meet that need or not. So we're going to bring together these two concepts, one of the data and the quality and quantity and usability of that data with the business concept. Is there ROI there? So we'll talk about that in a few slides, but we're going to bring these two concepts together. Right? Does the data generate signal? That is, Pam will go into some detail about what signal means. And then that last point you see highlighted is it generates the right champions, the right support. Back to the cultural issue that we saw was the first issue. A benefit of focusing on a particular AI use case is that you can connect it to the right champion in your organization who wants to support that use case, and that's going to help drive that cultural change. So it's certainly about business value, it's about data, and it's about having the right support inside of your organization for that use case. So I'm going to talk about what these business analysis steps are, and then Pam's going to talk about the data analysis steps. So business analysis, we break down into kind of two phases. The first is to actually discover what the potential use cases are, and we do that through functional interviews. You have the subject matter experts in your business, and certainly Pam demonstrated to you a list of typical AI use cases across different functions. I can tell you that every use case is unique to your business and the data that you have and the experience that you have in the market and your customers. So while there is that generic list of AI use cases, it's a great place to start. The implementation of that use case is going to be unique to the data that you have in your organization. So we start with discovery of those use cases, and then we talk about building the business case, because again, a good use case is going to show business value. So we're talking about both of those parts. So how do we discover the use cases through these functional interviews we have with your subject matter experts? It's fairly straightforward and understandable process. We start at the top. What are your company's strategic goals, right? What are the KPIs that identify success in those strategic goals? And then we have to start to break those down. I talked earlier about granularity. So now what we do is we start to look at your KPIs and break them down through what we call business decomposition. If a KPI is about revenue, what drives your revenue? It is a function of unit price, it's a function of mix, it's a function of market share, et cetera. Right? So we start to break those things down. Once you understand those drivers live in your organization in some business processes. And those business processes are typically where two key things happen. One is key decisions are made in those business processes. Should I raise price or not? Which customer should I actually deploy a service to or a solicitation to? Right? What shipping vendor should I use? Right? These are very specific key decisions that are made. And so those business processes identify those key decisions. They contain those key decisions, and they accumulate the data historically of prior decisions and where those decisions have been made and how they've been made. So getting down to the business process level is getting us down to that granularity. And ultimately, it's where prescriptive behavior comes from the predictions that you'll make. What you ultimately want to do is go back to those business processes, be able to go back to those same decisions and make a better decision because you have machine learning and AI. And that's going to drive back up that chain of business decomposition to your strategic goals, okay? The other thing you have to find is a target metric. So how do I know what's the outcome that I see in a metric at that more granular level if I've made a better decision within my business process, okay? And then lastly, back to that cultural change component, what executive would love to know the answer to that question, right? Who can I pick on to be the champion for this? Perhaps they can make the investment, perhaps it's because they have great influence in the organization and we'll be able to impact our culture positively that way and make AI something that grows instead of is feared and shrinks. So we'll talk about a quick example of this. This is one of my favorite examples about a search firm. This search firm happens to be involved in a very particular niche in the market. It's in secondary schools, right? Private and public secondary schools, and finding the right talent for those schools. And so they had a typical high-level company strategic goal, wanted to grow revenue, right? Well, okay, so let's start to decompose that. How do we grow revenue? Well, you can look at certain key drivers like, well, what's our market share? That's an important one. They happen to know about their market. It's niche enough that they can kind of see through other channels what searches are being done out there. What's their market share? Are they winning more of those search competitions? Are they getting more of those search competitions? And it turns out they were. So the real question became, well, how do we drive more revenue? We've got to win more of those search competitions. We're being asked to the party, but we need to win more of the search competitions. And I don't mean find the result. I mean actually be selected to conduct the search. So how do you do that? Well, you've got to prove that you can find the best candidate, right? But then what they understood driving down was a best candidate is not who meets the job description. I heard yesterday a radio commercial for a well-known search firm, Indeed. I'm sure we all use it to some degree. And their commercial said, we will immediately give you a list of candidates that match your job description. Well, that's table stakes today. That's easy to do, right? To do searches for what's in a job description and what's in a resume and find those that match. But what this firm knew from its experience was that best was not defined by who meets the job description the best. What they knew, because they have been doing this for so long, is that best is determined by other factors, right? How many years was someone in the role? How many of these positions have they been hired to? Are they upscale movers in the roles in this industry? Have we seen that track for them across time, right? In the targeted roles. So they had other data, 10 years of data to prove the correlation of what constitutes a really good candidate. And they could do a couple of things with that data now from a machine learning and AI perspective. One is they can certainly create a greater indication of who's going to be successful in a new role. So they can actually create a proprietary scoring algorithm that will provide the best candidates. And they can use the fact that they have that scoring algorithm in their sales process to win more of those search competitions. And equally, they can take that data and produce publicly available IP, marketing material, call it, so that it indicates and proves to the customer base out there in the market they compete in that they are set apart from their competitors, right? So anyway, that's an example of the business decomposition that leads to an AI use case. Second, of course, you have to build a business case associated with that. This follows standard practices with only a little bit of tweaks. What you have to do first is baseline the current state of the metrics. How are things going today, right? So we're going to have to prove that difference. We have to do that for those drivers that we identified as well as what the target measure is. And then we're going to forecast an expected improvement. And that's sometimes indicated by the data analysis that Pam is going to talk about that indicates what the signal level is and what you might be able to achieve from AI. So sometimes you'll have that input to do that, right? Other times, forecasting takes on a slightly different approach. It takes on this approach that at the bottom here called sensitivity analysis. And what that means simply is you may be able to say we cannot exactly identify what the improvement is going to be, because AI is not yet been executed to determine what the end point is. But what we can say is if this were to bring us just 2 more clients in a day, we have a current client that is a North American franchise client, and we're helping them understand what wait times are like for their customers. Well, AI can help them. If AI can help them drive 2 more customers a day at no marginal cost, that drops right to the bottom line, right? And that can be modeled and shown as a return on investment, right? So you'll have some deterministic information where you can model the benefits, and some where you'll have to do some sensitivity analysis on what if we got this much or this much or this much, right? And when does it become worthwhile with respect to any investments that have to be made? All right, with that, I'm going to hand it to Pam to talk more about the data side of the analysis.
Yeah, so as we're going through those functional interviews, as Paul mentioned, we're also looking at the data. We're understanding where the data lives, cataloging the use cases. So as we catalog use cases, we're also kind of filling in a spreadsheet. What are the data sources that we would need? Where can we find that? How much data is there? So part of that is high level. And then as we come to specific use cases, we may dig a little bit deeper, because you could have a ton of data and you could have the best data quality in the world, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's right for machine learning or that it's right for any specific given use case. And so it really has to be evaluated at a use case level. We want to look at data volume. Again, you don't have to have big data. I think that's a little overestimated. Sometimes, you may think you don't have a ton, but there's enough statistical significance there. We want to look at the content. So, you may want to predict some outcome, but if you don't have that prediction captured and measured, that specific metric, then we can't build a model. And so we're looking at, do you actually measure and store the use case KPIs? Do we have the things that we think would predict it captured in there? And if not, that's okay. Maybe we go and look for third-party data, but we need to know kind of, what you have and what we can bring in to add to it. I'm going to look at data quality. I don't expect data to be clean. It never is, really. But is it trustworthy? How clean is it? What steps would need to be done to clean it further? And data access. So is your data that I need for this use case stored in 3 different platforms or 10 different platforms? Is it centrally governed? And it doesn't mean that any of that's a game changer or that, this is straight pass fail, but it's important for us to know how much effort is involved to get you, to the actual data analysis. And that's because what we want to do, if you flip over to the next slide, what we want is, yeah, you can go forward.
Okay.
What we want is to, measure all these different aspects about the data and be able to plot every use case on their data viability and on their business viability. So everything that Paul talked about helps us to identify the business value of each use case. And then we're going to look at the data viability. Is it there? Is it clean? Is it accessible? How much work does it take to bring all that together and plot it on that data viability y-axis there? And you can imagine this as a whiteboard back, pre-COVID days. We're all in the same room together. You've got sticky notes for, different business leaders with their use case on them. And you can plot these because business viability sometimes is a little subjective and they can argue for it and say where they think it should be. But the outcomes of this are really important. One, we get those priorities. We know what there is high business value for and that you have the data ready and accessible. We know data remediation. These are high business value, but your data is not ready. What can we do to make that happen and get you there? You avoid those value traps, because sometimes when organizations are new to AI, they look at the data they have and they say, what problems can I solve with this, right? And we want to avoid that. What you want to do is say, what problems and goals does our organization have? How do we find the data to meet those with data analytics? And one of the most important outcomes of this is when you get all those business leaders involved in this process, it helps overcome that initial challenge of company culture, right? They get educated on AI. They understand very specific use cases. They understand the ROI of those use cases. So it gives people this ownership and engagement in the process. So, then you take those priorities and you move on. And here's an example from a real client, the outcomes, and I'll go through this quickly for the sake of time, but ultimately we cataloged a lot of use cases that we heard from them. We understood what our priorities are, data remediation, value traps. We also understood and realized that there are certain themes emerging there, that some of these use cases kind of cluster together. And the value of that is that you get the economies of scale. As you build one use case, we realize that the data we use and the features that we're extracting can be reused for some other use cases. And so the effort gets reduced for each of those other use cases within those themes. And so we can move through those. So this client that we went through this with, you know, they've already started to go through this and churn through these different use cases. They're getting value on their top ones. They've discovered which ones really there isn't signal in the data for. And with that, what we mean is, you know, the data may be clean and good, but is there actually a correlation between those features and that metric that you want to predict? So why don't you go ahead on, I want to make sure that we have some time to answer some questions here. This is our data science as a service platform. Really, it's what do you do next? How do you actually get started? And how do you do it in small bite-sized packages so that you can accelerate your process? So you can leave this here so people can read through it. And I'm just going to pull up some questions to make sure that we get these answered. One of these is, any chance you can give your perspective on third-party data? Definitely. You know, a lot of times your data that you have with your customers is very transactional. You know about your client's history with you, you know the transactions, you know what they tend to do, but you may not know what drives their decisions. You may not know about changes in their life that are going to lead to them churning away or needing a different service. And so that can all be enriched with third-party data. So you can understand your clients, you can make things easier for them, you can help present them with services, products, offerings when they need it at the right point in their life, and understand a little bit more about them. So third-party data is something that we commonly do with data enrichment and machine learning. I also let people know that you can try as many different algorithms as you want. If you really want to improve your model accuracy, you have to give it more data, right? It's machine learning, you're teaching a machine. And so bringing in data from a very different source, from a different perspective, adding that in is the best way to improve some model performance. And one other quick comment here, I guess this is an observation, not necessarily a question, but when we showed the barriers to AI adoption, budget was not on that list. And that's true. And I think that's an interesting observation. I also think it's probably very tightly coupled with the very first one there, that company culture isn't quite ready, right? Because if they don't really believe in AI, they don't understand what it can do for them, they're not going to have the budget for it. But all those barriers, I hear very often from companies that are willing and have the budget for it and just don't know how to get started. So I think it's just tied in with that.
Yeah, and Pam, as a shameless plug, I mean, that's part of the reason that we develop data science as a service, is because you can attack a single use case early on and prove that value without yet investing in a large staff or trying to perfect your data infrastructure or to buy the tech stack that's associated with doing that modeling and deployment, right? Pick the right use cases, get a good example done through data science as a service, and that proof, and particularly proof with a champion, will create the kind of budget that you need by proving success.
Yeah, excellent point. If anyone else has other questions, you can feel free to reach out to us. Register for the May series, and we'd love to hear more from you. So thank you so much for staying a few minutes late.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.